He stood at the edge of the wall, the bitter wind biting through his furs. News had arrived of betrayals and shattered loyalties in the north, and Jon Snow felt the stirring of duty beyond his vows. Ghost padded silently at his side, his red eyes glinting. Beneath that endless stretch of ice, Jon recalled the warnings that once held him in place. But the north bled, and he could not remain idle, locked behind stone and ice. The decision weighed heavily: betray his sworn brothers, or abandon those who needed him most. Winter was here, and he would answer. He made his choice at dawn. The darkness lingered in the sky, and the horn still echoed from some distant watchtower. Standing alone, Jon remembered the oaths he had taken. They had been so earnest, those words etched into his spirit. The shield that guards the realms of men. But if the Night's Watch could not protect the very land it stood upon, what good was that vow? Beyond the wall, danger stirred, but the greatest threat now crouched within Winterfell. Time was running out. Jon turned away, heart pounding, prepared to risk every bond he had once forged. A raven soared overhead, carrying messages from distant lords who once served the Starks. Jon could almost feel the chaos simmering south of the wall. The Boltons held Winterfell in a clenched fist, their cruelty staining the north with fear. Rumors reached him that the great houses wavered, either bending to the new warden of the north or preparing for a silent rebellion. Some believed that no one could stand against House Bolton's tyranny. Yet Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell, remembered his father's lessons on honor, and a defiance flared within him. He would not let them rule unchallenged. His farewell was swift, almost solitary. Some of his closest brothers in black suspected his unrest, perhaps glimpsed the tension in his eyes. Ed joined him in the yard as the first flakes of snow drifted. They embraced without words, bound by respect and sorrow. Jon offered no explanation but gave Ed his final instructions. If the Watch branded him a deserter, so be it. Duty pointed elsewhere. Above all, he would not depart without Ghost. The white direwolf, sensing Jon's resolve, stayed close. With that last glance, Jon left Castle Black, unsure if he would ever return again. Travel was slow. Snow-laden paths twisted underfoot. Jon wore the black cloak still, finding it gave him the anonymity he needed at lonely outposts and frigid villages. Along the way, he encountered people haunted by fear, stories of flayed men, and rumors of looming armies. The cold air tasted sharper with each story of Bolton cruelty. Jon's heart ached for Winterfell, for the memory of warmth and feasting, and for the rightful Stark lineage cast aside. He clenched the reins, determined to rally any who would hear him. His path lay clear: gather the north and stand against the wolves in sheep's clothing. Rumors of his departure preceded him. Across the scattered hamlets, whispers of a black-clad figure traveling with a direwolf circulated. Some scoffed, believing Jon Snow to be just another broken man on the roads. But others recalled Ned Stark's bastard, the young man shaped by honor and unwavering loyalty. Farmers, innkeepers, and even passing sellswords eyed him warily, unsure if this was the rumored hero or a tired deserter. He pressed on regardless. Dawn after dawn, he drew nearer to the heart of the north. Weary as he was, he drew strength from those who quietly thanked him for daring to resist. At one snowbound inn near the crossroads, Jon slipped inside to find warmth. The common room was dim, lit by a single hearth. A handful of travelers huddled, sharing hushed gossip about the Boltons. One recognized Ghost's towering shape and beckoned Jon closer. A name was whispered: King in the North. Another voice murmured, Stark blood. Jon shook his head, disclaiming any right to kingship. He had left the Watch not to become a ruler but to bring justice. Yet the spark was there and he felt it. A lost child of Winterfell, forging a path to claim what was owed. A messenger caught up with him before dawn. She was a young woman from the distant hill forts near White Harbor, breathless from the ride. She had heard rumors that he was rallying forces. She brought no great army, only a plea. Her kin and neighbors would rise if Jon led them. That simple message filled him with cautious hope. Word of his defiance was spreading. he accepted her vow, promising to assemble like-minded warriors. The wheels of rebellion turned slowly, but they were turning. As the sun rose, he thanked her and continued onward, determined to reach loyal hearts. Finally, Jon arrived at an abandoned holdfast once loyal to House Stark. Its walls were weathered, the gates broken, but it offered shelter. He found a group of outlaws encamped there, hungry and wary. They recognized him, or at least the direwolf by his side, and did not shoot when he approached. Their leader, a grizzled man with a scarred cheek, knelt before Jon, addressing him as Snow. In that quiet ruin, Jon spoke of reclaiming the North, of freeing it from Bolton cruelty. The outlaws listened in rapt silence, then pledged their swords. It was a ragged start, but it was a beginning. Within those crumbling walls, Jon laid out his plan. Each man had connections, whether to nearby villages or minor bannermen too scared to act alone. They would spread word of a rebellion. They would proclaim that a son of Ned Stark stood ready to challenge the Boltons. Many had lost friends or family to Bolton flayings. Their grief became fuel for the cause. Others saw a chance to restore honor to the North, an honor tarnished since Robb Stark's fall. Though his heart weighed heavily, Jon felt a glimmer of warmth. He was no longer alone. The North was awakening. Days bled into nights as they ventured across the snow-laden fields. The group grew, drawing in huntsmen, runaway servants, and scattered survivors of old battles. Most were fearful but willing to fight under someone who carried Ned Stark's blood. Jon listened patiently to their worries, each story fueling his resolve. They started small, raiding a Bolton supply wagon, liberating a handful of captives. Word spread of their success. Some called them rebels, others called them saviors. Raven by raven, clandestine messages soared to minor lords who had once been loyal to House Stark. Slowly, alliances began to take shape. Among those who answered was Lady Barbary Dustin of Barrowton. She despised the Boltons but carried old grudges against the Starks. Nevertheless, she recognized an opportunity. Her riders came bearing a tentative alliance. If Jon could promise certain concessions, she might throw her strength behind his cause. Jon faced her messenger with a steady gaze. He did not desire power for personal gain. All he demanded was Bolton defeat and justice for the North. That was enough for her, at least temporarily. With that, another piece fell into place, forging a tenuous pact. The North's scattered strength slowly knitted together. From Winterfell's direction, fresh tidings arrived. Ramsay Bolton, rumored to be even crueler than his father, had been seen riding out, terrorizing villages near the King's Road. Fear spread like an icy draft. Jon could not let Ramsay's cruelty continue unchecked. He led a small band toward the threatened villages, instructing others to ride across the North, marshaling more support. Their ambush came at dawn, a flurry of arrows and steel. Ramsay's riders, taken by surprise, scattered. Yet Ramsay himself escaped, leaving behind the bloodied snow. Jon grimly ordered that the wounded be tended. They could revel in no false victories. News of Ramsay's narrow escape spurred greater urgency. Jon needed larger forces to stand a chance against the Boltons' trained soldiers. He called upon the Mormonts of Bear Island, who had always been stalwart. He reached out to the Cerwyns, who once served the Starks. Some responded with immediate pledges, glad to avenge old wrongs. Others hesitated, fearing retribution or uncertain about Jon's power. Every day, more ravens arrived, bearing both hope and rejection. Jon rode from holdfast to holdfast, forging alliances with weary, downtrodden folk who recognized the name Stark more than Snow. Gradually, his ragged army took shape. Ghost's presence proved invaluable. The direwolf was a silent emblem of House Stark's legacy. Many who doubted Jon found their courage renewed at the sight of the great white wolf. Whispered legends swirled around Ghost, claims he was sent by the old gods, or that he symbolized the rightful heir of Winterfell. Jon neither encouraged nor denied those rumors. He let people believe what they willed. Each night, he gathered his captains to discuss strategy, the flicker of torchlight casting shadows on their determined faces. In these councils, John felt a sense of purpose that had eluded him at the wall. A crucial meeting took place in the main hall of a half-collapsed manor once held by a loyal family. Representatives from various houses assembled, wearing simple cloaks against the drafty air. They came with caution, unsure if Jon Snow could truly unify them. By the light of sputtering torches, Jon rose to speak. He invoked Ned Stark's memory, reciting the lessons of honor he had gleaned as a boy. He admitted his half-bastard status, stressing his love for the North above personal ambition. Silence followed. Then, one by one, they agreed to stand behind him. The rebellion now had a spine. From that night on, the campaign of small strikes escalated. Under cover of darkness, Jon's rebels liberated captives from Bolton outposts, destroyed supply lines, and scattered Bolton patrols. Though lacking the discipline of a formal army, they compensated with cunning and devotion. Bolton allies trembled as the rebellious wave grew. Hushed tales reached the ears of peasants, who dared to hope once more. When Bolton men rode into villages demanding obedience, they found those places oddly empty or bristling with hidden blades. The North, once cowed, began to stir like a sleeping giant awakened from a cold, hateful slumber. Ramsay Bolton, seething with fury, retaliated viciously. He dispatched his fearsome hounds to hunt down rebels and flayed any who resisted. Bodies dangled from trees as grim warnings. Even so, the tide of fear began to shift. Each atrocity only fanned the flames of defiance. Jon was haunted by nightmares of failure, but those nightmares drove him to fight harder. He trained recruits daily, teaching them to handle blade and bow with discipline. Among the ranks, he found old knights still devoted to Stark ideals. They became instructors for the inexperienced, forging a cohesive force from a once disparate multitude. Amid these skirmishes, a surprise visitor arrived at Jon's camp. It was Sansa Stark, slipped away from Winterfell's suffocating grasp. She had endured unspeakable horrors, but her spirit remained unbroken. Her arrival changed everything. Jon wept at the sight of his half-sister, hugging her close. In that moment, all the guilt and doubt he carried seemed to melt away. Sansa brought more than just her presence. She carried knowledge of Bolton weaknesses, numbers, and the layout of Winterfell's defenses. Their bond reaffirmed Jon's path. They were siblings, children of Ned Stark, resolved to reclaim their home and avenge their family's name. Sansa's words stirred hearts in the camp. She recounted the treachery committed by the Boltons, describing her own suffering at Ramsay's hands. Soldiers who had been on the fence now roared with indignation. Soon, ravens flew once more, this time rallying any who claimed loyalty to House Stark's rightful blood. The plan took shape. They would besiege Winterfell, but only after carefully undermining its defenses. With Sansa's insights, they learned weak points in the walls and potential internal allies, servants still loyal to the Starks. A cautious optimism spread through camp. For the first time, victory did not seem an impossible dream. A chill wind carried foreboding as the rebel host advanced toward Winterfell. They established a rough encampment in the nearby woods, hidden amidst snow-laden boughs. Scouts reported Bolton patrols circling the fortress, accompanied by snarling dogs. The rebels waited, hoping for an opportunity to strike decisively. Jon consulted daily with Sansa, with outriders, and with elders who remembered every inch of Winterfell. He knew the cost of open conflict. Many would die, but it was a price he was ready to pay. The thought that he might face Ramsay in single combat fueled him, a grim determination in each breath. An unexpected boon arrived in the form of reinforcements from House Manderly. Though they had feigned loyalty to the Boltons, they joined Jon under cover of night. Their numbers bolstered the rebel ranks significantly. Jon thanked them quietly, promising to restore the North's freedom once the battle was done. Manderly commanders offered strategic counsel, noting that a swift and coordinated assault might break the Boltons before they could rally. Yet timing was everything. Winterfell's walls were strong, and the Boltons had the advantage of fortification. Still, hearts burned hot in the rebel camp, fueled by vengeance and the memory of the Starks. Dawn broke on the day chosen for the assault. Snow whipped across the field, forming pale drifts. Jon assembled his forces in measured lines, dividing them into teams. Sansa remained behind with a protective guard, ensuring her safety. Ghost prowled near Jon's side, hackles raised. Ramsay's men stood on the ramparts, their banners flapping in the biting wind. The gates looked imposing, but inside, Jon knew fear festered. He reminded his fighters that victory would mean liberation for the North. Trumpets sounded. The rebels began their charge, breath visible in the cold air, hearts pounding with the weight of destiny. Bolton archers unleashed a volley, arrows slicing the sky. Shields raised, the rebel vanguard pushed forward, pressed by the urgency to reach the gates. Screams pierced the air as some fell. Jon advanced, urging them to keep moving. A battering ram, fashioned from a heavy tree trunk, slammed into the fortress doors. Men grunted in unison, each strike echoing like thunder. Above them, Bolton soldiers screamed insults, hurling stones and hot oil. Yet the rebels persisted, fueled by righteous wrath. The gates splintered slowly, timbers cracking. Ghost leaped at the few who dared to lean too far over the battlements. A resounding crash announced the collapse of the gates. Rebels poured in, clashing with Bolton soldiers in the courtyard. The sound of steel on steel reverberated. Jon led the charge, Longclaw flashing with lethal grace. Every corner turned revealed chaos. Frightened servants, savage dogs, and the stench of blood. Ramsay's men fought fiercely, cornered in their own fortress. A swirling melee overtook the yard. Jon bellowed orders, urging his troops to hold the line. Ghost prowled behind him, eyes glowing with primal fury. The Boltons, for all their cruelty, found themselves against a tide that refused to yield or falter. Somewhere in the fray, Ramsay appeared, clad in leather and mail. He wielded a wicked blade, slicing through rebels with manic glee. When his gaze fixed on Jon, a twisted grin spread across his face. He taunted him, mocking the name Snow and hurling vile insults about Sansa. Jon's blood boiled. They circled each other amid the shouts and screams. Ramsay's cunning was legendary, but Jon had determination and skill honed at the wall. Their blades rang in a deadly dance, each strike a testament to the hatred that had grown between them. The courtyard became their battlefield, and fate trembled. Blow after blow, they tested each other's limits. Ramsay, quick and unpredictable, slashed at Jon's arm, drawing blood. A hiss escaped Jon's lips, pain fueling his rage. He retaliated, forcing Ramsay to dodge. Sparks flew as steel scraped steel. Around them, soldiers fought and died, the courtyard a tapestry of violence. Ghost prowled, but Jon commanded the direwolf to keep distance. This fight was his alone. Ramsay sneered, daring Jon to falter. But Jon thought of Sansa, of Ned Stark, of every friend lost to Bolton betrayal. Gathering his strength, he thrust forward. Their blades locked in a decisive clash. Jon knocked Ramsay's blade aside, driving Longclaw into his enemy's shoulder. Ramsay recoiled with an enraged howl, blood staining his armor. Desperation contorted his face. He attempted a frantic counterattack, but Jon deflected it and slammed the pommel of his sword against Ramsay's temple. The Bolton bastard collapsed to his knees, disarmed and vulnerable. Jon panted, sweat mingling with blood. The courtyard fell quiet as onlookers realized the fight was ending. Hatred flared in Ramsay's eyes, but his bravado was gone. Jon held the blade to Ramsay's throat, remembering how many innocents he had flayed. Justice demanded swift retribution. He hesitated, if only for a moment. Then Sansa's voice cut through the stillness. She stood nearby, her face resolute, her eyes burning with the scars Ramsay had inflicted. She did not speak, but the raw anguish in her gaze was enough. Jon withdrew the sword, stepping aside. He wanted to end Ramsay then and there, but he knew Sansa deserved the choice. The crowd parted as she approached, calm as winter's chill. Ramsay spat curses, yet he trembled. Sansa knelt, meeting his eyes. "Your time is done," she whispered. The rage in her voice echoed every cruelty he had committed. She gave a signal, and from the shadows emerged hounds, no longer loyal to Ramsay. They snarled, half-starved, eyes fixed on the man who had once commanded them. Ramsay's cocky smile vanished. He begged for mercy, his voice ragged. Sansa stepped back, leaving him to the beasts he had so often unleashed on others. Jon turned away, though he did not block his ears to the screams. The last echoes of Ramsay Bolton's reign of terror faded into the night, swallowed by howling dogs. Silence descended, and the rebels stared in muted awe, uncertain how to feel about such brutal justice. That night, Winterfell belonged to the Starks once again. Fires were lit in the great hall, driving away the bitter cold. People cheered wildly, though the price of victory lay in their wounded and dead. Jon paced through the corridors, ghosts of his childhood swirling in every corner. He recalled running through these halls as a boy, always the outsider. Now he stood as the savior who helped reclaim his family seat. Sansa oversaw the clearing of Bolton banners, replaced with the direwolf of Stark. A sense of restoration filled the ancient walls, each stone breathing relief after so much horror. The battered rebels, now victors, gathered in the courtyard. Wounded were tended by makeshift healers. Survivors embraced one another, tears mingling with laughter. The Manderleys offered to help rebuild. Minor lords came forward, pledging renewed loyalty to House Stark. In a small corner, Ghost rested, head on his paws, exhausted from the battle. Jon knelt, stroking the direwolf's fur. He promised Ghost a decent rest soon, and maybe a hunt beyond the gates. Though the night was dark, warmth seeped through Winterfell. People raised cups and toasts, chanting Stark over and over, as though reclaiming an identity long snatched away. Sansa convened a council of the loyal northern lords. A day of mourning and commemoration was declared. The long hall was draped in solemn colors as everyone honored those lost to Bolton cruelty. Faint sunlight poured through the high windows, illuminating pained faces etched by war. Jon stood beside Sansa, uncertain of his place. He had led them to victory, but he felt a deeper conflict. He had broken his vows to the Night's Watch, and though it seemed justified, a part of him wrestled with guilt. For now, duty to family and the North eclipsed any regrets about oaths undone. When the ceremonies ended, the lords clamored for answers. Who would rule Winterfell now? Sansa was the trueborn daughter of Ned Stark, yet many eyes shifted to Jon, the one who had rallied them and bled for their freedom. Sansa stepped forward, thanking them for their trust. She spoke of the North's resilience, reminding them that unity was essential. Humbly, she acknowledged that Jon had fought for them at great personal cost. Then, she proposed a shared governance. The lords exchanged glances, old traditions struggling against new realities. In that hush, Jon realized the weight of possibility resting on his shoulders. A heated debate filled the hall, some lords urging Jon to accept the mantle of king in the North, others insisting Sansa remain sole ruler, as a legitimate Stark. Jon tried to quiet the storm, explaining he had no desire for a crown. Yet the lords saw a leader, one who carried Ned Stark's moral fiber. Sansa watched him, poised but quietly determined. She knew the North would follow Jon if he claimed the title. Finally, she placed a hand on his arm, leaning close. "We need each other," she said softly, and her words echoed in his heart, resonating with truth. Amid the clamor, Lady Lyanna Mormont's young voice rang out, sharp and clear. She declared that while Jon might be a bastard, he was Ned Stark's blood all the same, and that was enough for her. She berated those who wavered, reminding them that it was Jon Snow who had fought tirelessly. One by one, lords rose, proclaiming Jon the king in the North. He stood stunned, uncertain if he should protest. Sansa placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Surrounded by a sea of voices chanting his name, Jon found himself at the center of a moment he never imagined. With the great swords of the North raised, each lord repeated their pledges of loyalty. Sansa offered Jon a small, resolute smile. Steeling himself, Jon accepted, albeit reluctantly. He vowed to rule in the best interest of the North, to uphold the memory of his father and brother. The hall erupted in cheers. For a fleeting instant, John felt the enormity of this turn in his life. He had left the Night's Watch as a deserter, but now he stood crowned by the Northern Lords. Ghost let out a low howl, as if echoing the ancient spirits that dwelled within the castle walls. The following weeks saw swift changes. Repairs to Winterfell began, bolstered by supplies from loyal houses. Sansa organized relief for villages ravaged by the Boltons, sending out wagons of grain and provisions. Jon, adjusting to his newfound status, consulted with counselors, forging a plan for governance. He mandated a respectful treatment of all houses, even those who had hesitated to join. The North had bled enough. His ascension did not erase the hardships or the dead, but it gave people hope. Walls were reinforced, courtyards cleared of rubble, and a sense of normalcy emerged amidst the lingering snowdrifts. Yet doubt gnawed at Jon's soul. Late at night, he would pace the ramparts alone. Ghost shadowed him, silent aside from the crunch of paws on snow. Jon thought about his oath to the Night's Watch, an oath he had broken for reasons he believed just. Sometimes he wondered if he deserved his new crown. Sansa found him one night, gazing over the moonlit courtyard. She touched his arm gently. "I know you're torn," she said, voice hushed, "but you've given the North a chance to heal. Father would understand." Her words soothed him, but the ache lingered, an old wound. Ravens flew out from Winterfell, carrying notices of this new rulership. Some houses rejoiced, others watched warily. Foreign powers like the Iron Throne might object, but the North had always been proud and distant. The lords of the North reaffirmed their independence, believing their new king would protect them better than Southern kings ever had. Ambassadors from distant lands arrived, curious about the quiet bastard turned ruler. Jon met them with a measured courtesy, unimpressed by titles. He had seen worse than political posturing beyond the wall, and he carried that knowledge with quiet confidence. The North was forging its destiny. Amid these political changes, Jon did not forget the looming threat from beyond the wall. White Walkers and Whites were still out there, an ancient evil that brooked no borders. He hosted a gathering of loyalists, sharing what he had witnessed. Though it was difficult for some to believe, they trusted Jon's sincerity. Preparations for winter's fury took on a new urgency. Grain stores were bolstered, blacksmiths crafted dragonglass-tipped weapons, and rangers patrolled the northern boundaries. Over time, the image of a king who both defended from southern threats and dreaded evils beyond the wall took shape. Sansa excelled at the political intricacies, deftly navigating alliances and forging crucial bonds. She corresponded with the Vale, with House Arryn, hoping to secure broader support. Jon relied on her counsel, recognizing that ruling required more than swords. The people needed just leadership, fair laws, and a sense of stability after so many storms. In this, brother and sister worked together, mending old fractures within the North. Tensions lingered, though, particularly with houses that had cooperated with the Boltons. Jon struggled between exacting punishment and showing mercy. Each verdict weighed heavily, as if Ned Stark's ghost hovered, gauging his decisions. One crisp morning, Jon addressed a crowd in Winterfell's courtyard. He declared that any house found guilty of abetting Bolton atrocities would forfeit lands, but men who had been coerced under threat of death might be spared. This compromise did not please everyone. Some lords demanded harsher retribution. Others feared the repercussions of punishing entire bloodlines. Still, Jon believed in offering a chance for redemption. He recalled the old ways, how the Starks had governed with both fairness and firmness. The courtyard resonated with a renewed hope. People began to whisper that the king in the North was wise beyond his years. While Jon grappled with governance, a letter arrived bearing the seal of the Night's Watch. The contents were brief, informing him that the Watch considered him a deserter. There would be no formal condemnation, as the Watch had lost so many men. But his vow was broken, and they would not welcome him back. Jon sighed, the finality of it striking him. He thought of his old brothers in black, the camaraderie they had shared, the loyalty he once felt. The letter cast a shadow on his heart, but he tucked it away. His course was set, and he could not turn back. News also drifted from the south. King's Landing was rife with intrigue, with Cersei Lannister's power waxing and waning. War threatened on multiple fronts, and the Iron Throne could not afford to march north just yet. It gave Jon time to solidify his hold. The lords at Winterfell questioned whether they should send envoys south, possibly to negotiate recognition of the North's sovereignty. Jon hesitated, remembering the tragedies that befell Robb Stark. He would not bend the knee lightly. Still, open war with the crown would drain the North's limited resources. Balancing these concerns, he decided to wait, watching for clearer signals. Amid the reconstruction, Jon rekindled ties with the wildlings who had followed him in part through the wall. Though tensions remained, he knew their help could be invaluable in a future war against the dead. A small delegation arrived, led by Tormund Giantsbane, who embraced Jon like a brother. Tormund teased him mercilessly about his new title, snickering at the idea of King Crow. Still, Tormund voiced support, acknowledging that a united North might stand a chance when the White Walkers came. Jon welcomed them, forging a fragile peace between Northerners and free folk. This alliance, once unthinkable, now felt vital. Haunted by the future, Jon insisted on fortifying the northernmost castles. He sent soldiers and wildlings together to repair old watchtowers, ensuring warning signals could be sent if the dead advanced. Though some free folk chafed at taking orders from kneelers, they respected Jon's leadership, recalling Hardhome and the times he risked his life for them. The soldiers, too, learned to accept wildlings as allies, if only grudgingly. Over time, this uneasy coalition began to function. Perhaps the real enemy they all feared made old enmities seem trivial. Gradually, walls were rebuilt, weapons forged, and watchfires lit for the cold nights ahead. During this period, Sansa proposed a great feast at Winterfell, a symbolic event to unify the North and free folk. Banners of various houses, along with clan markings of wildlings, adorned the great hall. Tables overflowed with roasted meats, hearty stews, and flagons of ale. The hall buzzed with cautious excitement. Tormund laughed boisterously at northern lords who eyed him warily. Ghost lounged near the dais, occasionally snapping up scraps. Jon, seated at the head of the table beside Sansa, acknowledged each toast with a nod. Despite the merriment, a quiet tension underpinned the celebration. The future was uncertain, and everyone felt it. Late into the evening, the music quieted. Lords and free folk listened as Jon spoke. He acknowledged past conflicts, but called upon the North's traditions of resilience. He reminded them that winter would be long and harsh, demanding unity. Sansa followed, her voice steady, describing the horrors she had endured and the hope she saw in their gathering. The applause was genuine, if tempered. Many who had tasted war realized that more trials lay ahead. Yet for one night, they feasted without fear, forging tenuous bonds over bread and salt. When dawn came, the great hall glowed with the remnants of shared purpose. For the next few months, the North's consolidation progressed. Ambitious minor lords vied for positions in Jon's councils, while older houses guarded their privileges. Jon did his best to distribute responsibilities fairly. He relied heavily on Sansa's keen intuition, which often saw through sycophants. They appointed able stewards for the treasury, watchers for the granaries, and skilled masons to oversee repairs. The people appreciated seeing their king in the north ride alongside them, visiting distant villages to hear grievances firsthand. Ghost's silent presence reminded them that Jon was no ordinary ruler, and his personal concern kindled loyalty in their hearts. But the nights grew darker, colder. Whispers of strange sightings beyond the gift reached Winterfell. Travelers spoke of blue-eyed corpses that moved at twilight. Jon ordered more patrols, uneasy about the creeping threat. Each day he meditated on the final confrontation he knew was inevitable. Would the scattered forces of the North and the free folk be enough? Would King's Landing help if war with the undead broke out? His worries pressed on him, a burden he could share with few. Still, he pressed forward, focusing on fortifying the region. He had no illusions. the real war had yet to begin. One frosty morning, a raven arrived bearing a sealed message from an unfamiliar source. It claimed that Daenerys Targaryen, mother of dragons, had landed at Dragonstone. Rumors spoke of dragons reborn, armies of freed slaves, and alliances with powerful houses in the south. Could she be an ally against the White Walkers or another threat? The Northern Council debated fiercely. Some saw potential in forging a pact with the Dragon Queen, while others distrusted any southern claimant. Jon considered sending an emissary, for if the White Walkers were real, dragons might tip the scales. But caution reigned. He could not leave Winterfell unprotected. Soon, another raven came, confirming the presence of Targaryen forces. The letter requested the North's submission or at least an audience. Jon rubbed his eyes, the weight of kingship pressing once more. The memory of Robb's downfall lingered. Sansa urged him to consider a diplomatic approach, given the precarious situation. They might need dragons against the undead. After counsel and deliberation, Jon decided to send a trusted envoy, perhaps even go himself if the risk seemed acceptable. This decision could alter the North's future significantly, but ignoring the Targaryen presence might prove equally perilous. Before he finalized plans, a more pressing concern arose. Scouts from the far north reported increased White activity. Multiple villages were found empty, with footprints leading nowhere. Bones scattered the snow. Terrified survivors spoke of silent, relentless killers. Jon gathered his commanders, insisting they must investigate. Tormund volunteered, leading a small force of wildlings and northern rangers. Winter was tightening its grip, and time seemed to be running out. Even as matters of southern politics loomed, the living dead felt like the real priority. Jon prayed the gods would grant them the strength to face this new wave of horror. His nights were filled with unsettling dreams. He saw the wall collapsing, waves of ice washing over Winterfell. He woke each morning with renewed urgency. Yet the daily tasks of rulership could not be ignored. The realm needed justice and stability. Reports arrived of petty squabbles turning violent. He dispatched men to quell unrest, punishing bandit lords and restoring order. Winter had a way of making everyone desperate. Food supplies had to be carefully rationed. Sansa oversaw the distributions, ensuring each household had enough to survive. It was a delicate balance. Keep them alive now, and prepare for an even graver threat soon. Word arrived that Tormund's expedition had encountered a large group of Whites. Though casualties were significant, they managed to capture an undead creature to prove the threat was real. They hurried back, the nights becoming longer and more perilous. Jon decided this evidence might be crucial to convince any southern power, including Daenerys Targaryen, that the undead danger was not a myth. The arrival of that caged White caused panic within Winterfell's walls. Servants whispered of cursed magic, and some lords demanded it be destroyed at once. Jon stood firm. This White was their grim envoy, proof of an apocalypse in waiting. Thus, preparations began for a delegation south. Jon would leave the north in Sansa's capable hands, taking the White as undeniable evidence. He hoped to persuade the Dragon Queen or at least secure an alliance. The departure loomed, casting a somber mood over Winterfell. People lined the courtyard, some silently praying for their king's safe return. Jon embraced Sansa and thanked her for her steadfastness. She urged him to be careful, her worry evident. Ghost, unsettled by the upcoming journey, paced in circles. Jon patted the wolf's head, choosing to leave him behind to protect Winterfell. They parted reluctantly, the dire wolf watching with solemn eyes. On the day of departure, the sky was leaden with thick clouds. Wind whipped through the courtyard as the party assembled. Horses snorted, uneasy. Bundled in furs, Jon mounted his steed and led the small procession out the gate. Alongside him rode trusted companions. A few loyal knights, veterans from the rebellion, and the cage housing the unnatural captive. The weight of the road ahead pressed on them all. As the gates of Winterfell closed behind him, Jon felt a pang of longing. He thought back to the boy he once was, an outcast bastard, naive but hopeful. Now he rode as the king in the north, burdened by more than any vow could capture. Traveling south was a stark contrast to the battered northern roads. Despite the cold, signs of life were more abundant, and the threat of whites seemed distant. Yet danger lurked in different forms. Bands of outlaws roamed the highways, remnants of ongoing wars. They tried ambushing the royal column, but John's men fought them off, the caged whites screeching in the chaos. News of the king in the north's journey preceded him, raising as many questions as it answered. Could these travelers truly carry an undead creature? People whispered in awe and dread, making warding gestures at the sight of the cage. As they approached the neck, John's party was met by soldiers bearing the banner of House Reed. Their lord, sympathetic to House Stark, provided them safe passage and supplies. He listened skeptically to the tales of whites, but withheld judgment until he saw it firsthand. The caged monster was a terrifying spectacle, even inert. Whenever they drew near, it snapped and hissed, reanimated limbs rattling against iron bars. The Reeds shuddered, vowing to spread word that the threat was indeed real. John departed with renewed urgency. If the southern lords saw the undead for themselves, perhaps they would unite against the impending storm. Further south, the climate eased slightly, though a chill lingered on the wind. John's men remained vigilant, haunted by the knowledge that winter touched the entire continent eventually. Villages they passed were relatively intact, a stark reminder of how local wars rather than undead nightmares afflicted these lands. John recalled his father's words. The North was always more exposed to the harshest elements, the first line of defense against threats beyond the wall. Now, that old lesson felt ominously real. He pressed on, determined to complete this mission quickly and return to Winterfell before the worst of winter's wrath descended. At Moat Cailin, they navigated the ancient fortress, crossing into territory historically contested. The gloom of the place unsettled even the bravest. The roads were lined with standing water and dreary bogs. John was reminded of how any southern army marching north had to pass here, a bottleneck that had once provided significant defense. Now, it felt like a boundary between two worlds, the realm of the living unacquainted with the undead threat, and the north, where winter's terror was all too familiar. The men shivered, less from the cold than from the creeping dread of what lay ahead. They reached the Riverlands, finding them scarred by war. Burnt farms, ransacked villages, and forlorn survivors told stories of shifting allegiances. Many recognized Stark banners from old loyalties, offering what little they could. Others eyed the group suspiciously. The caged white incited fearful shrieks. John reassured them he meant no harm, explaining they traveled to broker an alliance against a far greater enemy. Some believed him, passing along rumors of Lannister movements. Others were too broken by war to care. Still, John's company pressed on. Each day that passed took them farther from Winterfell, and his longing to return grew stronger. Eventually, they reached the outskirts of the Crownlands. Patrols loyal to the Iron Throne spotted the small column from afar. The Watchers approached, cautious. Jon explained he was king in the north, traveling to see Daenerys Targaryen at Dragonstone, not the Queen Regent in King's Landing. Some soldiers, uncertain of their orders, allowed him passage but warned that Lannister eyes were everywhere. Skirmishes between Targaryen loyalists and Crown forces had erupted. The roads were perilous. Jon felt the precariousness of his situation. A newly minted northern king with a terrifying secret to show, venturing into a war-torn realm far from home. Following the coastline, they finally glimpsed Dragonstone's jagged silhouette rising from the sea. The fortress loomed on a rocky island, windswept and ominous. Targaryen sails dotted the harbor, and soldiers bearing the dragon sigil patrolled the beach. Jon's party halted, hearts pounding at the sight of a dragon soaring overhead, its roar shattering the air. The men clutched their mounts' reins, terrified. Even the caged white thrashed wildly, perhaps sensing the dragon's fiery presence. Jon gritted his teeth, recalling old tales of dragons that once shook the world. If these creatures fought the undead, perhaps there was hope, or perhaps doom. At the shore, armed Dothraki and Unsullied awaited them, their stances wary. Jon raised a hand, declaring his purpose. Missandei of Noth, advisor to Daenerys, approached, welcoming them but stating that the queen demanded they relinquish their weapons before being allowed inside. Tension crackled in the air. Jon's men bristled, but he saw no alternative. Reluctantly, they surrendered their swords. The caged wight, however, remained tightly locked. Missandei led them up the winding steps toward the fortress. The path offered a commanding view of the sea, whipped white by cold wind. Above them, another dragon circled, watchful and menacing. Jon's heart pounded as they entered the throne room. Torches flickered on carved stone walls, casting dancing shadows. Daenerys Targaryen sat upon a formidable seat, flanked by advisors. Her regal bearing was softened by curiosity as she studied Jon. He bowed politely, though not fully, signaling respect without submission. Daenerys demanded to know why the king in the north had come. Jon inhaled, glancing at Tyrion Lannister, who stood by her side with an enigmatic expression. He proceeded to recount the existential threat of the White Walkers, culminating in the unveiling of the caged wight. Gasps and horrified exclamations echoed. The wight thrashed violently, jaws snapping in a frenzy. Even the Unsullied stepped back. Daenerys' calm poise wavered at the sight of this unnatural abomination. Jon locked eyes with the Dragon Queen. "This is our enemy," he said quietly. He explained that his purpose here was to seek her alliance, not to bend the knee. The living must unite. Daenerys, shaken but composed, asked many questions, her mind racing at the implications. Tyrion, unsettled but fascinated, chimed in, pointing out that such threats had nearly faded into legend. The tension in the room eased, replaced by grim understanding. Daenerys questioned if the North's independence was non-negotiable. Jon, weary from the burden of leadership, stated that his people had bled too much under Southern crowns. But if she aided in the fight against the dead, he would find a way to work with her. The two leaders locked gazes. A profound silence stretched out. Then Daenerys rose, her decision clear. She would help, for the living must stand together. A measure of trust formed between them, fragile yet critical. The wight snarled in its cage as if protesting this newfound unity. But the pact was made, forging a path that could reshape kingdoms. Tyrion proposed a strategy. An expedition north to witness the threat firsthand, an alliance sealed in battle against the dead. Daenerys considered sending her dragons, but worried about leaving her southern conflicts unattended. After lengthy talks, they agreed to dispatch a smaller force first, testing the undead's position and seeing how quickly their armies might mobilize. Another raven would be sent to Sansa, alerting Winterfell of the new plan. Jon's men looked to their king, hopeful this alliance might tip the scales. Outside, the dragons roared, as if punctuating a moment that carried the fate of nations on its wings. As the negotiations continued, Jon grappled with a tumult of emotions. He had abandoned the Watch, an act once unthinkable, to save the North. Now he was forging alliances with a queen of dragons to save everyone. The scope of his duty had widened beyond anything he could have predicted. Each decision carried profound consequences. When Daenerys finally ordered the wight locked in a secure chamber, they all exhaled. The monster's presence frayed nerves. They could not let it roam free. Plans formed for a combined force to head north, hopefully before winter's full fury descended. Time was their enemy, as much as the undead. Jon took a moment to speak privately with Tyrion. They walked along the ramparts of Dragonstone, waves crashing below. Jon asked about the Lannisters' perspective, and Tyrion admitted to wanting peace, believing Daenerys offered the best hope for stability. He also cautioned Jon that southern politics could be treacherous. Jon nodded, grateful for the candor. He reiterated the severity of the undead threat, describing Hardhome, the Night King, and the countless wights. Tyrion listened intently, his clever mind already spinning solutions. If the living did not unite, all of their intricate political dances would be rendered meaningless beneath the storm of walking death. An uneasy alliance settled over Dragonstone. Soldiers of House Stark, free folk, and Targaryen loyalists exchanged cautious glances. Yet they trained together, practiced with dragonglass, and discussed tactics for confronting whites. Daenerys oversaw the forging of new weapons from the island's rich dragonglass deposits. She and Jon spent hours conferring on strategy, gradually developing mutual respect. Some noticed a growing warmth between them, though neither openly acknowledged it. The future hinged on fragile trust. Even the dragons seemed calmer around Jon, as if sensing an old connection. Perhaps Targaryen blood recognized Stark honor, forging a bond across centuries of history. Before long, ravens from Winterfell arrived. Sansa reported an intensifying cold, more sightings of undead in the far north, and skirmishes between wildlings and whites. She pleaded for Jon's swift return, cautioning that each day of delay could mean disaster. Jon showed the letter to Daenerys, his eyes reflecting urgency. She agreed they must act soon. With a final round of planning, they prepared to sail north. The combined contingent, smaller than a full army but strong enough to scout and hold key positions, departed Dragonstone. Jon stood at the prow of a ship beside Daenerys, gazing northward with a heavy heart. Sails billowed in the icy wind, the sea churning beneath. The journey was fraught with tension. Northerners, Dothraki, unsullied, and a smattering of advisors traveled together, forging a patchwork of cultures. At night, they huddled in cramped quarters, too wary of each other to sleep soundly. Even so, shared danger knitted them closer. Jon often found himself deep in conversation with Daenerys, discussing the North's customs or listening to her stories of Essos. Each day, the ships edged closer to White Harbor, where they would disembark. From there, they would head inland to meet Sansa and rally the North against the undead threat. Upon reaching White Harbor, the cold was immediate and bracing. The Dothraki shivered under thick cloaks, unused to such chill. Locals, initially wary, peered at the dragons overhead. Daenerys set 2 dragons to circle the harbor while the third perched on a distant hill, scanning the horizon. The city bustled with hushed excitement. Seeing dragons in the north was akin to witnessing living myths. Jon quickly set about organizing supplies for the march inland. White Harbor's lord offered hospitality, albeit nervously. Daenerys was gracious, promising that no harm would come to the city so long as loyalty was maintained. Fear mingled with anticipation. Scouts arrived from Winterfell, confirming an increase in undead sightings. They relayed that Sansa had strengthened the defenses and recalled as many loyal forces as possible. Casualties mounted along the edges of the kingdom, where the dead prowled at night. Jon's jaw tightened as he heard these reports. The days of politicking were behind them. The war for survival had begun. The combined force set forth, a grim procession braving swirling snow and perilous roads. Dragons soared overhead, providing a measure of confidence. But the north was vast, and the undead could be anywhere. With each step, the tension grew. After days of grueling travel, they approached Winterfell. Even Daenerys fell silent at the sight of the ancient stronghold. Stark banners fluttered on the ramparts, and the gates opened to admit the unusual entourage. Sansa stood in the courtyard, flanked by northern lords and wildling leaders. Relief and caution played across her face at the sight of dragons overhead. She embraced Jon, her eyes flicking to Daenerys with guarded curiosity. The tension between them was palpable, but they greeted each other politely. Survival dictated unity. The arrival of such a force could tip the upcoming battle, if they could coordinate properly. A war council convened in the Great Hall that night. Tormund detailed the enemy's movements, describing pockets of whites roaming beyond the last hearth. Bran, seated in a chair, spoke in cryptic tones about the Night King's approach, referencing visions of an expanding army of the dead. Daenerys shared her plan to deploy the dragons to strike at the White Walkers' leaders. Jon urged caution, explaining that conventional siege tactics would fail. They needed to lure the dead into a decisive confrontation. Sansa pointed out vulnerable areas around Winterfell and urged them to fortify. Hours passed in tense deliberation. As the meeting adjourned, each leader departed with tasks to complete. Jon lingered, leaning over a map of the north. Daenerys stood beside him, her expression resolute. They discussed final details in low voices. She confessed her fears, admitting that dragons or no, she had never faced an enemy that did not fear death. Jon squeezed her hand, acknowledging his own dread. Their eyes met, understanding that everything hinged on this alliance. Whether they triumphed or fell, they would face the army of the dead together, forging a bond stronger than any vow. Winter's chill settled, but in that moment, they found a spark of hope.